Hi, Michael. Welcome.
Hi, Melissa.
You're going to
Here
be
we are back.
moderating the trade and tariff panel today. We've got quite a treat.
Yeah, well, we've got some a
You're
great.
going to be moderating the trade and tariff panel today. We've got quite a treat.
Oops. We got a great lineup, and we're going to start with giving an award to Congressman Brian Higgins, of New York 26th. But Congressman Higgins was all ready to come onto the show, or the conference. I guess it seems like a show. But a friend passed away, a colleague, and he had to, Congressman Higgins had to go to the funeral. But can we bring Kayla on? Kayla is, welcome Kayla. Kayla is Congressman Higgins' legislative director. And we were actually going to give the American Trade Hero Award last year. But I'll tell you what it is back when we were fighting hard against Trade Promotion Authority back in 2015. That was really a turning point in the trade battle. President Obama wanted Trade Promotion Authority, of course, as presidents before him did, and both the leadership in the House and the Senate wanted him to have it. It was Boehner leading the House, and I guess it was probably McConnell in the Senate at that time. And we and others fought pretty hard against Fast Track, Trade Promotion Authority, Fast Track. And in the House, we actually won the first vote. They had a series of votes. We had the first vote. We won slightly, and in that they voted against TPA for the president. And then they did Boehner, and at that time, Ways and Means Chairman Paul Ryan schemed at some procedural thing, and they took another couple of votes, and they got it through. But after that, trade promotion, Trans-Pacific Partnership was dead. There's just too much resistance to these offshoring trade agreements. As a result, we at CPA, we gave every no vote, every congressman and senator that voted no in the House and the Senate, we gave them an award, the American Trade Hero Award, for voting against Fast Track at that time. And then since then, we haven't given that many awards because there's quite a few voting no. We've given usually 2 to Congress and sometimes 1 to somebody in the administration. So last year, obviously, COVID hit. It was 2 weeks before the conference. COVID is hitting. We're thinking, do we have a conference? Do we not? What do we do? What do we do? And then it became clear you just can't have a conference, and we canceled it. So this year, we're giving the 2020 award to Congressman Brian Higgins, who's in Buffalo, represents the area around Buffalo, New York, and very pro-worker, and has been a very much for a pro-U.S. trade policy. Kayla Williams, you're here to accept for him. You can see the award on the screen, what it looks like. And Kayla, we're proud to have you here, and would you like to say a couple words?
Yes, thank you so much, Michael. I'd just like to express on behalf of Congressman Higgins his sincerest gratitude for being awarded the American Trade Hero Award for 2020. As you know, Congressman Higgins' priorities, especially in the trade space, is to prioritize the American worker and the American manufacturer. He has a long record of advocating for strengthening our manufacturers here and opposing policies that would allow for the offshoring of American jobs and American, basically, ingenuity in manufacturing. So we'd like to say thank you very much for honoring Congressman Higgins with this award, and we look forward to continuing to work with the Coalition for Prosperous America to strategically create trade policies and economic policies that benefit American manufacturers. So thank you so much, Michael.
You're welcome. There's a lot to do. So we look forward to working with you and the congressman in the future. All right, so we're going to move on to our panel now. We've got a great panel. Proud to have, again, as I said, we've had more elected officials senators, congressmen, government officials than we ever have this year. And while none of this particular panel has faced a vote, it's a great panel, and we're very proud to have them on. So we have Jason Kearns, who's the chair of the International Trade Commission. Jason I've known for several years, since he was chief trade counsel at the Ways and Means Committee. He and I and others worked together on the currency manipulation battles at the time, trying to get a currency manipulation bill through. And he also has been at the USTR General Counsel's office before that. So we're going to hear what he has to say from his position as chair of the ITC now. We're also proud to have Marty Davis, who is a chairman and CEO of Cambria, Inc. in LeSueur, Minnesota. Cambria is a family-owned company that started in the dairy business many decades ago and was successful in dairy, butter, cheese, and ended up in other businesses, including the quartz countertop business. And they have done very well. I've been to his headquarters in LeSueur, Minnesota. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. And he has direct experience fighting Chinese subsidized incursion into our market and IP theft. And we're going to hear how he successfully fended them off. And we're also proud to have Stephen Vaughn on the panel. Stephen is a trade lawyer currently at King and Spalding. He was more recently USTR General Counsel, working with Bob Lighthizer and the Trump trade team to help turn trade policy away from the neoliberal free trade disaster that it used to be, and into something that remains to be seen what it becomes. He was for a short time acting U.S. trade representative, while Lighthizer was nominated but not yet confirmed, and he was formerly at Skadden Arps. And Stephen, atypical for a trade lawyer, cares more than just about AD/CVD or anti-dumping cases and countervailing duty cases, and is a neoliberal thereafter. He cares about the economy and making the economy work for Americans. So I'm going to start with a question to Jason. And some basics, really, and then it's forward-looking. But Jason, not everyone knows what the ITC or International Trade Commission is. If you could just let us all know what is the ITC, what's its purpose, and then and what are the challenges your agency is facing right now, and then really we're interested in how do you see the ITC changing or adjusting as in this era where free trade is being eclipsed by something else, which might be Hamiltonianism, national developmentalism, industrial policy. You could call it American nationalism, or economic patriotism, something. So go ahead, Jason.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Michael, for having me. It's good to see you again, and also to see Stephen and Marty. I know Marty's testified before the ITC, and I see Stephen regularly testifying before the ITC. So good to see all of you. Before I continue, I should note that I am speaking in my personal capacity, and my views are not necessarily the views of the commission. But the purpose of the ITC, we basically do three things. First, and maybe foremost in most people's minds, we act as judges in three kinds of cases. We determine whether a U.S. industry is being injured by dumped or subsidized imports from specific countries, as we did in the court surface product case that I worked on with Marty Davis. And if they are, additional duties are imposed to counteract the dumping or the subsidies. Second, and it's kind of like the first, but we determine whether there's a surge in imports from all countries and whether that surge is causing serious injury to a U.S. industry. If it is, then we can impose temporary relief to help an industry adjust. That usually takes the form of tariffs as well.
That's like the 201 solar tariffs and the clothes washer tariffs we've heard about in the last few years.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And it's interesting, and it kind of goes to the broader point that you're making, which is there hadn't been any 201 case since, I believe, roughly 2000 until the solar case came in and the residential washers case. So again, it kind of goes to the point of how trade policy has really kind of changed in the past few years. The third kind of case is we determine whether or not imports are otherwise being traded unfairly. This typically takes the form of intellectual property violation cases. And we're able to block, or if the president ends up agreeing with us, we're able to block imports entirely of those unfairly traded imports. So that's the first thing we do, is we work as judges to determine those things. The second thing we do is we really serve as a government think tank on trade. We provide reports and other independent analysis on trade issues to the Congress and to the U.S. Trade Representative. And so some examples of that right now, the Senate Finance Committee has asked us to look into censorship in China and understanding what kind of impact that has on U.S. companies and on the U.S. economy. We've also evaluated the economic impact of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement that replaced NAFTA. And so we do a lot of different economic analyses like that. The last thing we do is we actually are the ones that change the numbers on the tariff schedule whenever the Congress or the president makes such changes to that. And so, of course, under President Trump, we did that with respect to the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, with respect to the China 301 tariffs, and we're also doing it with respect to changes to eliminate duties on COVID-related products as well. We are a very independent and nonpartisan agency, not part of the administration. We have 6 commissioners, or we're supposed to. Right now we have 5, and you can have no more than 3 from any one party. We are a very independent commission. We each serve 9-year terms. That is 1 year longer than any president can serve, and that's by design to ensure our independence. And I think, in my view, now more than ever before, the ITC is really needed because trade has become a bigger part of the economy. It's become more complicated and more controversial. And I think we need that kind of independent voice, expert views and independent voice to help sort through some of these difficult issues. You asked about the challenges facing the ITC. And I agree with you as kind of a premise that the free trade mindset seems to be being replaced quite a bit. Trade is no longer considered necessarily and automatically good, no matter what its terms are, no matter what other countries do to gain an advantage over U.S. companies and workers. And so I think we're seeing a more assertive approach taking shape, one that insists on reciprocity more, one that recognizes trade is a lot more complicated and nuanced. And this new mindset creates 2 challenges for the ITC, to answer your question. And I very much welcome those challenges, and they're very real. First, as you can imagine, we have been very busy in all of these areas. So whether we're determining whether or not an industry is injured by imports, whether or not we're doing more studies on what kind of impact trade has on the economy, and also in our changes to the tariffs, that's all keeping us much busier than we were 10, 15, 20 years ago. The economic studies we do are much more complicated than they used to be because we're recognizing trade is more complicated than I think we used to think it was. So our first challenge is basically we just aren't receiving the funding that we need to keep pace with these growing demands. And that affects everything we do. And we're working with Congress now to try to get more funding for our work. The second challenge, and the only other real challenge I would point out to today, is developing new ways of thinking about the economic impact of trade. To be blunt, I think our models of trade are too simplistic. I'll give you one example. As I mentioned, we did an economic analysis of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. One thing that the Trump administration has insisted on in that agreement was that more content of a product had to be manufactured in the United States and in North America to get the benefits of the agreement. It's called the rules of origin. But the way most economists look at that, those more stringent rules of origin simply raise costs in their minds. And they think that overall is bad for the US economy. So to many economists, we shouldn't ask where the parts come from. For example, we should just allow a car made in Mexico to enter the United States duty-free, even if all of the parts are made in China, and even if China refuses to open its market to the United States. That's basically the way our current economic models, or the models that have been in place for decades, work. So the lower the rule of origin, the less stringent the rule of origin, the better off the US economy is from many economists' perspective. I think that's all starting to change. We're starting to realize it's a lot more complicated than that. There are real benefits to things like that. But again, I think the economics profession is several steps behind. So for example, it wasn't until 2014 or even 2016 that an economics paper came out that took the profession by storm by finding that imports from China had the result of loss of many U.S. jobs. So in many ways, again, the economic theory seems to be several steps behind, kind of common sense. But I think we're hopefully catching up. And I know you, Michael, and your colleague Jeff Ferry are very familiar with that, and we've been working with you on ways to model the economic impact of trade agreements better than we have, and we continue to keep working on that. But to me, those are the two challenges, and as I said, I really think the ITC has an extremely important role to play right now, both in terms of trade enforcement, just the rules of the road, but also understanding the impact of trade better than we have in the past.
Great, thank you, Jason. Yeah, you're chairman at a very interesting time in history, and I'm glad you're there.
Thank you.
Let's shift to the other side of the bar. Someone who's presented a case before the ITC as opposed to adjudicated it. Marty, you want to tell us a little bit more than I did about your company and you and the challenges that you face from the Chinese and what you did about it? And Marty, you're on mute. Go ahead and unmute.
Good afternoon, Michael, and I'd be happy to do that. And good afternoon to everybody viewing. Our company was founded 20 years ago. We did, as you said, come from the dairy industry. So we'd been in business and manufacturing for many years. But our advancement into the quartz surfacing industry began in 2000, 2001. So we're a young company. And we invested several $100 million over about a 12-year, 13-year period into our factories, into our technology and our branding and positioning of this what was a startup company. And as we began to achieve some wind at our backs, if you will, the company lost money or broke even for nearly a decade. But by the time 2010 and 11 came around and the economy from 08 had rebounded, we started to see a surge in the housing industry and certainly in our space. We had innovated a variety of products that were unique and that allowed us to penetrate the marketplace at a more accelerated level. And our business started to flourish and prosper, and we continued to grow the business during that period of time. By the time 2016, 17 came around, we had invested over $450 million in fixed assets, plant and equipment in our enterprise. And at about that time, or shortly before that, but certainly exposed to us in about that time, the Chinese had begun to observe what we had done and others in our industry in the United States. And from 2011 and 12, they went from almost $0 of imported quartz material, quartz slabs is what we make, into the United States countertop market to over 1.5 billion in money equated dollar amounts, what we would say dumped into the United States. And by 2016 and 17, our marketplace was reeling from that. And as a result of that, the pricing was being rapidly depressed and the share was declining. And by the time the dust settled, the Chinese had attained 65% of the marketplace as a percentage of the market profile, and were supplying at that level. And we were in a decline, along with many other domestic and importing quartz companies from around the world. And our initial analysis of the Chinese was driven by our observation, Michael, and folks, that around their violation of our IP. And as we explored various ways to defend against their violation of our unique designs that we had patents and so forth on, we learned very rapidly that a number one, a more expedient, and number two, a more effective way to deal with them was to attack or respond, I guess, in defending the free and fair trade platforms. And at that time, existing U.S. trade law was being violated both on a subsidy and a dumping basis. So we pivoted over from the IP aspect of that and started exploring with legal counsel in Washington, an effort and review of how we might defend that with trade enforcement actions through the Department of Commerce and the ITC. Again, it became apparent to us that the Chinese were violating existing U.S. trade law. And one of the economic patterns that became very evident to us is that the Chinese were selling quartz slabs, and it's a product sold by the slab or the square foot, but they were selling that product into the United States and into the market at a price point that was below our raw material cost. And so very, very depleted economic platforms were being developed. The market was beyond being commoditized. And we went to work with a legal effort by petitioning Trade and Commerce to review our case. They, in fact, did that. It took about a year. It was one of the few times, I think, that I was very impressed with the wheels of government, because they moved it along, I thought, quite rapidly, faster than I thought one could. I think Jason's very right. There were 3 commissioners in the ITC that were Democrats, 2 were Republicans, some were Bush appointees, some were Obama. So it was a mixed effort. It was a very independent, I felt, a high character operation. And they came in and reviewed everything about us, and looked at everything that was occurring on the China economic platforms in our space, did a very thorough review, demanded much of us to prove our case and to prove our narrative. And after about a year's time, we in fact achieved 300 to 500% tariffs. They identified that China was indeed violating existing U.S. trade law. In the midst of it all, we stopped a $100 million capital expenditure project and a hiring of about 300 more employees. We have about 2,000 employees in our company, and our manufacturing workers, about 1,200 of them in southern Minnesota, excuse me. And their average salary in the first 2 years, manufacturing unskilled labor, coming out of maybe a high school condition, is over $45,000 a year. And our average pay in manufacturing after a period of years of service is well over $60,000 a year. So these are good paying Midwestern manufacturing jobs that were being depleted and would have been reduced substantially. With the award, we won the tariff award, and the injury was confirmed by the ITC with a 5-0 vote of all the commissioners. And it turned the marketplace around rather rapidly, frankly. There were some issues with dumping during the case, so there were some extenuating circumstances. It took about a year and a half to 2 years to really to evacuate the pipeline of supply. China accelerated greatly their dumping during our case, so they had reservoir, if you will, on the ground in the United States. And ultimately, that the market got righted, I would say. It became, again, a market-based economy, not a command-driven economy by a foreign party dictatorship that funds their industry with their public treasury. And as a result of that, we have just reactivated that capital expenditure project. We're going to invest $120 million in a new line and factory in our southern Minnesota operation. And 2 other factories, domestic factories, have activated the same type of activity in the United States, and those lines are in the process of being commissioned as we speak. So the impact that they were having was substantial. The impact that we're going to have was even more substantial. The surprising part of the process for an American domestic producer was how difficult it was to accomplish this. We spent over $5 million to get the government to enforce existing U.S. trade laws. And in addition to that, we had much opposition on the ground in the United States, something different than a communist dictatorship. There's no opposition to policy. But we did, and that is the resellers in the United States hired very substantial legal teams and lawyers in Washington And there was many of those resellers that were in those channels that came and protested, attacked our company, attacked us on social media, attacked our partners and dealers, boycotted us, protested at the Trade Commission. There was 100 or more people protesting. It was a very acrimonial process in our industry. We were somewhat attacked as protectionists, and I heard Jason say earlier about how free trade is maybe no more. I say it a little different. You can't have free trade without fair and equitable trade. And there just isn't fair and equitable trade without the processes that the United States Trade Department and the Commerce Departments employ on the behalf of the manufacturers and the workers of America. And really what it comes down to is it's about the workers, the manufacturing worker that is skilled in processing and manufacturing, and whose jobs have been vacated over the past 20 some years since we were very errantly allowing China to be put into the WTO on a permanent favored nation status. And again, as Jason said, non-political. Both the Clinton administration and the Bush administration had failed policy in this area that ultimately cost our company what it did by 2017. So I think that the great narrative is to really try to accomplish the public, the consumer, to understand that the fair trade narrative is a false narrative without a combination of equitable, fair, and free trade carrying the day together. And we were pleased with the process, but it was a very, as you can imagine, arduous process. It was a very expensive process, and we had to prove that we had standing as a manufacturer. So it was very rare that a private company of our size had the standing as a domestic supplier. So there were no politics. There were other public companies that produce the same product we do. They wouldn't join our case because they had public brand and public company issues where they're afraid of the backlash that we received. As a privately held company, I didn't care. I was too upset about the matter and was going to fight like the Dickens to protect our employees and our company and everything we'd invested. So we were fortunate that we had nearly 60% of the domestic supply was produced by our company, or we would have been paralyzed on this. And many companies in other industries are. And I reflect now as much as the investment of $5 million, the attack to our brand, we lost position with our IP, our designs, that we'll never gain back. We were going to take share that we were going to consume and maintain, and our economic benefits and growth would have been even more tremendous. We won't get those back, but we were fortunate that we were able to do what we did and live another day to grow our business. It's growing again in the way we have. And I just feel for the people in the steel industry and in some of the aluminum industry and even the textile industry, what happened to them during this period where the guise of cheaper is better. I've had opportunity to sit down with one of the founders of one of the big 5 tech companies. And in our debate about China, he said to me more than once, cheaper is always better. That is such an erroneous, false narrative. And it leaves so much without definition and so much without understanding. So I'm a big fan of the ITC. I was also impressed, Michael and viewers, the ITC commissioners are very diligent. They came to our factory. They did their work. They're very, very bright people from economic backgrounds and otherwise, and very, very non-political. But without the Trump administration and the support that the Trump administration's narrative and philosophy, if you will, around trade policy, and if they were to hearken back to the Bush and Clinton years, it was evident through my discussions with them that they felt, if I could use the term, hamstrung by what the policy of a given administration and the Congress is. So while they can do their jobs, it's very important that they have the support of the administration and the Congress. Both the administrations and the Congress failed since 2001. when we made the mistake of putting China in fettered free and without enforcement of the rules of what they were supposed to engage upon. And
Yeah.
that's a big factor that has to be recognized, and that policy and the narrative and the public knowledge of what the dynamics really are is really going to be critical to the future, whether it's the Biden administration or any future administration.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And I'm going to have to, that's right. And you're showing us, and what Jason showed us, what we're seeing with the past panelists is, we're not done yet. And the tariffs, when you have an industry and that's under attack, tariffs can make that industry spring back very, very quickly. It's a very fast reaction. In some industries, we're trying to build back, but for you, it sprung back with steel. We saw it in a lot of sectors in China. We saw it in solar. There's so much capital waiting to be deployed. If they can be protected from predation, it really springs back. I'm going to move on now.
Michael, I want to add one quick thing.
Yeah.
The tariff is misdefined. It's a trade enforcement tool, and it's a critical trade enforcement tool. To call it a tax is absurdity in my mind. In most instances, it's our only measure that we can use to protect our economic well-being from foreign interventionists of that nature. The Bush administration vacated, in a sense, tariffs and petitions like ours during their administration. And those things, to me, aren't well enough known. And they did the reverse of a tariff and hurt companies in Indiana and throughout the United States with their misguided economic policies related to trade. So thank you.
Good point. And a lot of countries, including us, can use them for industrial strategy purposes too, but definitely as a core trade enforcement tool. So Stephen, you and Ambassador Lighthizer were, not only ground zero, I mean, you were a substantial cause of everything that we're talking about here. You came in with the Trump administration that had pledged to work on China currency manipulation, narrow the trade deficit, renegotiate NAFTA. But basically, what that message was that old style free trade policy controlled by the globalists and international capital was not part of your plan. And so tell us about your experience in making the change, bringing tariffs back, and fighting the unreformed free traders, not only in the Democratic Party but in the Republican Party, and in the media. I mean, you had very few friends. We were friends, but of what you were doing, but you had very few friends, and you were undeterred.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here. This is a great panel you've put together. It's an honor to be here with all these folks. And I just want to sort of build on some of the things I think you've heard from Chair Kearns and from Mr. Davis. When I look at this situation, where it was 4 or 5 years ago, I think we had a situation where a lot of folks in town had sort of gotten used to the idea that the U.S. was going to be fairly passive when it came to issues of trade policy. And there were there was really a whole generation of policymakers who hadn't spent a lot of time, working on actually making trade policy. I mean, someone like Chair Kearns, who'd been at the House Ways and Means Committee, or some of the other people in town knew about it, knew how it works, but a lot of sort of regular members of Congress and even a lot of people, with Hill experience and inside the administration, there just hadn't been a lot of work done on trade policy over the last 20 years. And there had been a general attitude, at the end of the Cold War that we had sort of solved a lot of these problems. If you go back to the 70s and 80s, for example, Congress, regularly legislated on trade. There was a Trade Act of 1962. There was a Trade Act of 1974. There was a Trade Act of 1979. There was a Trade Act of 1984 and 1988. I mean, they updated trade policy back then in much the same way that they update tax policy. But with the end of the Cold War, there was a real sense in Washington, I think, that we've kind of figured this out. We're all going to be democracies. We're all going to be free trading countries. We're all going to kind of work together. And we can work out a lot of this stuff, through the World Trade Organization or through NAFTA or through some of these other organizations. And that was sort of the thought that held sway in Washington for a long time. And there was also a real concern that if you try to use tariffs, if you try to use industrial policy, if you try to interfere with the market at all, that it'll spin out of control. And so there was a lot of talk about Smoot-Hawley and the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 1930 and how they supposedly had bad effects on the economy. And so the first thing that you had going on in town was this attitude of just people being afraid and saying to themselves, well, if we try to interfere with trade, won't it have these really negative effects? And then the second thing is that, people just hadn't done it in a long time. There just hadn't been a lot of, the type of dialogue that you need to have a successful trade policy. So I guess what I would say is that, first of all, we were very fortunate. President Trump was willing to take the criticism. He was willing to take the heat. He was willing to back us up and try some of these things, regardless of what was being said in the press or being said elsewhere. The second thing is that we found that once we started, really getting into this, people get it in Washington. I mean, it doesn't take members of Congress long to figure out. They're great negotiators themselves. They understand how negotiations work. They understand leverage. They understand trying to get other people to move in the direction you want them to move. And members want to help their constituents. I mean, that's what they want to do. So we found that once we started kind of talking more in town, a lot of the people at the think tanks and a lot of the people in the media, they were very rigid and very ideological. But when you spoke to people at, the career people at USTR or people at the Trade Commission or people up on the Hill, we found a lot of pragmatism. We found a lot of people who were interested in, well, how's this going to work and what's it going to do? And they were much more interested in kind of the how and why of things, as opposed to sort of hiding behind these kind of rigid ideological restrictions. And so I think what you saw over the last few years was we had this very successful, bipartisan dialogue. So on something like the, NAFTA, which had been a thorn in the side of a lot of people in DC for a long time, that agreement was able to get replaced with a whole new agreement that passed overwhelmingly up on the Hill with a lot of bipartisan support. On China, I think we now pretty much have a good bipartisan consensus in terms of the problems facing us with China. And I think we have a good bipartisan consensus that the U.S. can make its own trade policy. This isn't rocket science. It's not magic. You can make a bad trade policy, right? Just like you can have a bad tax policy. But nobody thinks we should not have the Congress make tax policy and replace it with a world tax organization. We do the best we can, and if it works, good. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else. And so I think that's kind of where we are. And I'm encouraged to see, a lot of the comments from the new administration. They seem to be taking a pragmatic approach. They haven't sort of laid down strict, rigid rules one way or the other. I think they're, actively, they're going to be reviewing everything, which is what they should do. They're going to be talking to the Hill, which is what they should do. They're going to be talking to stakeholders, which is what they should do. And they're going to be talking to our trading partners, which is what they should do. And I think, as they start to get they'll see, where they think they need leverage and where they think they have leverage. And I'm sure they're going to try to do the best they can to get better deals. And there's been a lot of talk here in over the last few years about, populism and the voters and how do you address this? And to me, the easiest way to deal with it is, have policies that are going to lead to a strong and vibrant middle class. And I think now the elected officials are taking more responsibility for these things, and we're handling this more here. The U.S. has been really, really good at making trade policy actually for over 200 years. And it takes tweaks and it takes upgrades, and people like Kayla and her boss have some very difficult trade-offs and some difficult choices to make between the farmers and the manufacturers and between certain parts of the country and other parts of the country. But the truth is that's what Congress is for. And when you hear them talk about it, when you hear them sort of talk to each other, they can work it out the same way we've been able to work it out for a really long time. So if I were to sort of say one thing, I would say that's kind of the biggest breakthrough, I think, in the last few years, is that now, instead of having a conversation about should we have a trade policy, should we try to do this ourselves, now I think we've sort of moved past that, and now we're kind of on to more interesting questions, like a lot of the questions that, the Chair Kearns raised and some of the questions that Mr. Davis raised. How do we how do we balance and how do we encourage U.S. manufacturing? How do we make sure there's a level trade playing field? How do we, integrate our economy with other economies that have different rules? These are tricky issues and difficult issues, but Americans have worked through these issues for a really, really long time with a lot of success, and I expect that to continue.
Thank you. You and your team did just an amazing job, and I said before, it's really historic.
Thank you very much. It was an honor to have the chance to do it, and it was just it was an honor to be able to work with Ambassador Lighthizer and the whole team over there. So just thank you very, very much.
And we're obviously not done, and I know you're not going and retiring and playing golf. But
no.
There's, you did switch to, we do have bipartisan agreement on the challenge of China now. We do seem to have mostly bipartisan agreement that we get to start making our own trade policy. But on the issue of tariffs and the WTO, I want to come back to. It's you disrupted the old view that tariffs are always bad all the time, I think. And this is for all of you, I believe. But we were always told, and Jason, the economic models in your shop always said, if anything raises prices, including tariffs, you're going to get less consumption, then you're going to get less demand, and thus you're going to have job losses and everyone will be worse off. And we heard when the tariffs went into place, we're going to have inflation and we're going to have unemployment and that sort of thing. None of that happened. And we still haven't really gotten through the consciousness of the economists or the reporters or the politicians in a lot of the country. What happened? They still think tariffs raise prices. And I mean, one way I've been able to successfully talk about it in part is that a country is not built on the back of cheap consumer prices. You build a great country with purchasing power, increasing purchasing power and production. Now that seems to make some sense to people, but I know, Jason, you're fighting those, you mentioned it before, those old models that are just wired to say that anything, including tariff, that raises those prices is going to be bad for the country. So in the context of the models which you and your staff produce in reports that go to the public, go to the Congress, they're just not right. All this that China did to build their industry would have looked like insanity and just a total trip to to a worse economic condition instead of a better one. Can you talk further on that?
I guess the one thing I would point out there, and this is, I think, a good example of the problem, we have had a lot of economists come in and talk to us from outside about the impact of the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs as just one example. And, and in essence, the conclusion they reach is what you would expect, that it's very costly to the U.S. economy, costly for input. As an input for downstream industries, you can imagine the arguments. And to be honest, I mean, I understand part of that. I think there's something to it. But what's frustrating from my perspective is no economists come in to say, guess how disruptive it was for it to have massive overcapacity in steel and aluminum caused by foreign governments, trade distorting policies, foreign governments that, have a very different economic model, that have no concern about, supply and demand. They're just going to be the supplier. No one was really coming in to talk to us about what kind of impact that has. So, I mean, I guess my point would be we need to think about that more than we have. And I think, before the last administration, there were ongoing negotiations at the OECD and in other venues to talk about those issues, but they weren't getting anywhere. And that should not be much of a surprise. We had no real leverage. If you're not willing to use tariffs sometimes as leverage in negotiations, what are you going to use for leverage? And I just don't think there really was any real leverage we had in those ongoing negotiations year after year after year that got us nowhere. And so to me, even if you see some of the downsides to tariffs, and I think there can be downsides to tariffs, you got to ask yourself compared to what, and what is your leverage going to be? So That to me is the point, and that's was sort of missing, I think. And steel is a classic example of the need to how tariffs can be helpful. And to be fair, I mean, I don't think we've solved that problem, right? I mean, we still have we don't have the perfect and the ideal outcome on that yet. But at least there is this recognition that you got to have some leverage in a negotiation, and that's one way to do it.
We're working on internally a model tariff schedule right now, which is an ambitious project, which is not yet ready for prime time. But anyway, Marty, we see people protested. You're just a greedy company trying to raise prices, and everyone's just trying to get by. But what did we see? What did you see with the prices? To what extent did the tariffs impact the consumer prices or the consumer's ability to put in new kitchens and that sort of thing?
Well, the competitive landscape was not at issue prior to China bringing what was really a false economy funded by the Chinese Treasury to our marketplace. So the competition remained. Prices did not escalate by any measure, and that competition is foreign. We are not anti-competition. In fact, I did not support the tariffs against Europe because of the Spanish supply, who's our number one competitor. They are in a market-based economy, and we compete with them and have every day. And so I think we did not see that inflation. I think a lot of the missing narrative here, not to pivot, Michael, is Wall Street. Wall Street is for Wall Street, and Wall Street is, and they should be. But that does not allow them to get into the room, the for America room. And they get in that room too much. And that's economic suicide for the United States. And that's what drove a lot of this. That's what drives the Congress, whether it was Hank Paulson or Bob Rubin. These are the folks from Goldman that ran our Treasury departments during that period of time. And we need to call it what it is. Wall Street has different interests. And the reason that big tech founder said that to me is all his new customers aren't in Minnesota, and they're not in Ohio, and they're not in Texas. They're in China, and they're in Africa, and they're somewhere else in the world. And so his interests are growth, and the big tech and the Wall Street Goldman people is growth. That's not necessarily Americans' economic interest. And I think that's the challenge that we have. Competition will remain, and it does. If something's too good in America, people will come and compete with you to take some of the good. And that works just fine, and it continues to sustain today, Michael.
Thank you, Marty. Good thoughts. Stephen, you took the heat all the time. The economy, I mean, we look early on, China was still a cute, cuddly panda. And tariffs were horrible. It was they were not to be spoken of. And when you did them, the 232s, the 201s. I mean, we saw the 201s with solar panels, solar installations went up and solar prices went down during the course of the tariffs. During the 232, the automobile companies were complaining, and everyone was complaining. We never saw auto prices go up. The consumer didn't. You can't detect a consumer benefit, but we saw hundreds of millions in investment. But tell me, what did it look like from your perch when you were seeing the data coming in surprisingly well on employment, on inflation, but you were still had this sort of narrative that the collective insanity of everyone that was imposing that didn't have the facts behind it.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just say quickly, I should have said this earlier. Obviously, I'm just speaking for me, and I'm not speaking for any of my current clients or the rest of the administration that I worked in. Second of all, I think what you're hearing from everybody on the panel, and I think you've sort of done a good job of laying this out as well, Mike, that we, in a sense, we were putting the cart before the horse, right? In other words, that if you go all the way back to the days of Alexander Hamilton and his report on manufacturers, the way it works is that we decide what kind of a country we want to have. Do we want to have a middle class? Do we want to have a manufacturing base? Do we want to have, this industry or that industry? Are there certain areas that it's critical for national security that we be involved in? What's our foreign policy like? What countries do we want to help? What countries do we not want to help? We make those decisions as policy decisions, and then we implement or our elected officials implement policies, they're going to try to get us to those results, right? In the years before 2016, we had sort of put it the other way around. We basically said, well, these are our policies. And that means that we're going to lose this many manufacturing jobs, or we may lose these industries, and this may happen. And then it's going to be up to us to kind of adjust. And that's really not the way it should be. So going back to your question, we expected the tariffs we didn't expect a huge amount of inflation. We thought the markets would be very competitive. We thought what we would probably be doing is we would be putting more, we would be encouraging companies to hire more Americans. We'd be encouraging companies to keep more jobs here in the U.S. And we thought that would lead to higher wages. And by the end of 2019, we were really starting to see that with the increase in median income and some of the things happening with low wage jobs and more investment taking place in the United States. And to me, that's the way it's supposed to work. Now, obviously, can you go too far? Can you have tariffs that are so high that they would, kill investment? Well, of course. But I mean, we could also raise the taxes to 90%. I mean, the fact that you could make a bad policy doesn't mean that you don't make a policy. What we do is we do the best we can to say, this is the type of a country we want to have. These are the goals that we want to accomplish. These are the tools that we think are going to work. And then, as you said, Mike, you have to really watch that data. We watch those import numbers every month. We watch the market every day. We check the prices to see what was happening. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't, you change it. And so I think that's really how you do it.
Well said. Well said. We have a lot to talk about, but I'm going to go into I like what you said. You decide what kind of country you want. You decide you're going to have a middle class. To have a middle class, you need purchasing power. And to have purchasing power, you need jobs. And to have jobs, you got to have a manufacturing base that increases productivity, that justifies giving raises over time. So that's important. Now, we do have this, there's one other thing you all did was you sort of poked the WTO and exposed a lot of its problems. I know Obama and the Obama administration had poked a little bit around at the problems and was not going to reappoint certain appellate body members, but you really sidelined the WTO and you decided that we weren't going to have our trade policy made in Geneva. Tell us about that a little bit, please.
Well, I think, we talked about the WTO was sort of formed at a time at the end of the Cold War where there was a lot of optimism, a lot of hope that the world was ready to come together around some of these things. And I think from the beginning, there was always a bit of a misunderstanding. If you know the Hill, like Kayla does and like, Jason does, then that, the Constitution gives the authority over trade policy to the Congress. And the Constitution makes the President of the United States Commander-in-Chief, and the President and the Congress are answerable to the voters. And that's the way it's always been for the U.S. So it's really not possible for the U.S. to sort of take a central part of congressional authority and say, we're not going to have this authority anymore. You're never going to see a time, I think, where members of Congress are going to go home to their constituents and say, I know you're not happy about our trade policy, but I'm just a member of Congress. I don't make trade policy. I don't have anything to do with that. Trade policy is made overseas. And I think that was always kind of a misunderstanding. We thought that what we had agreed to was a basic set of rules, more like a contract, right? And we'll comply with these rules and other people will comply with the rules. And if you're in those rules, that's fine. And if not, then we can bring cases against each other. But outside of that sort of narrow set of rules, countries still retain their traditional sovereignty to do whatever we wanted. That's what I think the Americans always thought that they had agreed to. I think a lot of folks in Geneva, and certainly a lot of folks, in some of the other countries that we deal with, particularly the European Union, they felt like, well, no, what you guys agreed to is a process, right? And so whatever comes out of that process, those are the new rules. So they felt like, if we can't agree as members, but the appellate body can agree and issue a new decision, well, then everybody's going to be bound by that. And so what was happening, and you're right. The Bush administration complained about this, and the Clinton and the Obama administration complained about it. As time went on, the appellate body was just sort of narrowing more and more and more that window for what U.S. policymakers could do, and it was really creating a strain because, the voters here expect policy to be made here, and it's not acceptable to them to have members or to have the president come out and say, well, I wanted to do this, but the WTO tells me I can't. So, we decided to go ahead and proceed with what we thought were going to be the right policies and take the heat for any criticism that we would get at the World Trade Organization. We felt like, because of the problems with that dispute settlement process, we weren't in a position to agree to put new people on that appellate body. Now, as of now, there's not anybody on the appellate body. And so I think, that's going to be a big challenge going forward for everybody to kind of figure out, because there's obviously a very strong desire in the rest of the world for the U.S. to give up a lot of its leverage and give up a lot of its ability to make its own trade policy. But I don't think we've ever agreed to that, and I don't think the Congress is ever likely to agree to that. So hopefully other countries will start to be more realistic about what the WTO can be and about what the U.S. can agree to.
That's a good point. Jason, we've got about 4 minutes left, and we actually don't have a lot of wiggle room because the system shuts us off at the top of the hour. So we'll be mid-sentence and, too bad for us. But anything to say on the WTO sovereignty issue, Jason?
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, I very much agree with Stephen. He and I may have a slight difference on I mean, in my view, and I saw this working on the Hill, when you would tell a member of Congress or their staff, your bill is WTO inconsistent, they'd say, well, I don't want that. I respect the WTO. The members I worked with, they all said they respected the WTO. But I feel like the appellate body has destroyed its credibility, really, and the trust that members of Congress have in it. Because we thought, that we agree, like Stephen said, it's a contract. We're going to fulfill the contract. We're not going to do anything more. But they're filling the gaps. They're taking this beyond what we had agreed to, and that's really damaging to the institution overall. Not just dispute settlement, but also negotiations. So it has to be fixed. And I was in negotiations and discussions in Geneva where we were just completely dismissed and not listened to for years. And so it had to come to a head like it did. So hopefully they'll learn from this going forward, but it's going to take a lot of time, I think.
Well, I can tell you from the manufacturer point of view, or my members, that we have a very sour view of the WTO overall. We are tired of being the country that eats everyone else's overcapacity at the cost of our jobs and to spur their economic growth and their job creation. And the WTO is a place where they don't want the party to end. It's a great gig to have, to be able to over rely on another foreign country to offload your overcapacity and to achieve your goals of full employment. We don't feel they have any interest in changing that. And we've been doing it for 40 years, including during the WTO time. So we in the manufacturing out in flyover country don't have any allegiance to that WTO. And we want to go to Congress and say, you guys fix it. And we don't want to hear about Geneva. Marty, anything you want to add on that?
Don't forget, under the Bush permanent favored nation, there were a bunch of state ownership rules and all kinds of WTO policy. Then, like every other global policy with the Chinese, they don't follow it. So we follow it. They violated every state ownership percentage that was put in as a requirement, and they do it every front. And we all know we're going to be talking about environmental aspects of that. They don't follow any rules. And then we got this kind of type of personality, certainly as a country, that we want to keep our agreements. And that's really been the takeaway of what's happened over the last 20 years.
And we could do a whole nother panel on China, and actually we are tomorrow, but it doesn't happen to be this panel. We could have taken the whole time on China. Well, I'm honored to be a part of this panel. Kayla, thank you again for your boss. Stephen, thank you for what you and your old boss did. And Jason, thank you. And Marty, you're all very inspiring in your own ways. We appreciate it, and we look forward to more gains this year to rebuild this country.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again.